Tennessee State Standard US.02 says to examine federal policies toward American Indians, including the movement to reservations, assimilation, boarding school, and the Dawes Act. We're looking at what happened with Native Americans shortly after the Civil War. And what's going to happen is a long, sad history of being treated unfairly is what we're going to start with. So the first thing that really started this whole thing is manifest destiny. What manifest destiny is this movement by Americans to settle the West. So during this time period, Americans become convinced that it is our destiny, it's our lifelong goal to go and settle the West, to move out west, to tame this wild land, and to make it ours, make it part of America. But the problem is there is a people group that is on that land, Native Americans. So as Americans, you can see on this map, as we continue to move west, we're going to run into problems with these Native American groups. And so our solution is really pretty simple. It's this idea called concentration. And while it might be simple, it's not a great idea. What our idea is to take these Native Americans who are living on massive amounts of land and reduce them down to living in certain areas. So concentration was where we force, I'm going to put NA for Native Americans, to move onto what are called reservations. So we would take, these Native Americans who, for their entire existence, have been, free to roam wherever they wanted to on the Great Plains, and we say you can't do that anymore because we have Americans who are coming out here who want to farm, who want to do this and that. So you've got to live in this tiny little area, and usually this tiny little area, these reservations, were not on very good land. All right, so they were not on good land. And the reason they're not on good land is because the good land is going to our settlers. So we're kind of forcing these Native Americans to live in these areas that just aren't very good. And if you look over here on the bottom right, this map right here, it shows you the locations of most of our reservations today. And as you can see, there's really not a lot of reservations left. There's more out west, obviously. There's one tiny one here in the mountains of East Tennessee. That's where the Cherokee people live. And then there's some other reservations out here in the west. After concentration had run its course and was no longer really working, the United States decided to change to a different approach. Our next approach is called assimilation. And what assimilation is, let's put down a definition for it. Assimilation is when you make someone change who they are. So it's when you make someone change who they are. So the reason we're going to do this is we decide that leaving these Native Americans on reservations is just not working anymore. We need that land for, our civilians, our settlers. So we need to take these Native Americans and turn them into Americans. We need to make them to start acting like us. So that's another thing about assimilation, is where you force people to act like you. And it's very tough for the people who are being assimilated, because all of a sudden you're being told, hey, you've done this your entire existence, but you're gonna have to change because you're gonna have to fit our standards, what we expect. And so obviously there's gonna be a lot of resistance. Native Americans are not gonna want to give up their way of life, their traditions, their gods, their language, but they're gonna be forced to. And one of the ways that the United States went about doing this was through the use of what are called boarding schools. And boarding schools are really, the name kind of gives them away. They're a school where you're boarded, where you stay. And so what these were was put down that they were schools where, I'm going to put NA for Native American children sorry, I can't spell, Native American children are sent to live and learn about white society. So we decide, the best way to assimilate these people is to take their kids. And rather than let their kids being taught how to be a Native American, let's teach them how to be Americans. Let's send them all across the country to different schools, make them stay there, and let's turn them into Americans. And so that's literally what we did, is we took this proud people and we, stripped them of their customs and forced them to become like us. And like I said, this was our solution once concentration wasn't working. So initially it was concentration, and that gave way to assimilation. The next thing that the United States does to deal with Native Americans after we had turned to assimilation is we've got to force them to start living like Americans. This tribal life, this living on the land and surviving on what you kill. Nah, this is not good enough for us anymore. So we come up with this new law, and this new law is going to be called the Dawes Act. And you can see there's the name, and then over here on the side there's two political cartoons about the Dawes Act. And what the Dawes Act does is pretty simple. It's going to try to force Native Americans to live like white Americans. And to do that, it had to change where they lived. So what the Dawes Act did is it took reservation land and it divided it up. And it told Native Americans, you can no longer just live on the reservation. You have to live on this tract of land within the reservation. And this cartoon in the top right is a perfect example of that. You've got, in the foreground right here, you have these teepees, which is traditionally how these Native Americans lived. And you can see that they've got their campfire and everything. But up here, the U.S. government is telling these Native Americans, it says each man to his own plot. And out here in the back of the picture, you can see the ground has been divided up into different plots. And it's saying, look, the way you're living right now, where you're just living in teepees, you're living off the land, you got to stop that. Every single one of you guys needs to move on to these little plots of land. You all need to turn into farmers, and you need to live this new style of life. And as you can see, that probably is not going to go great for some of these Native Americans. So let's just put down kind of what we just described right there. So it forced Native Americans to live on land and become farmers. And it's another step towards assimilation, right? It's trying to take these people and make them become more and more like the white Americans that they're living around. And the other thing, look at this cartoon down the bottom right, the other thing about the Dawes Act is there's kind of a corrupt side of the Dawes Act too, okay? It's not just for assimilation, okay? Think about what's happening with this land. Not all the land in the reservations is going to be going to Native Americans because there's just not enough. The land that was left over, just kind of somehow found its way to white American ownership. So let's just put down that any land left over was given to settlers. And that's what this picture right here is, okay? You can see down here it says Indian lands, talking about these reservations that the Native Americans had owned. And you can see this giant person, this white person, is chomping away at these lands. He's, making a big hole in the land, all this land that he's taking. And obviously, that person is labeled as the Dawes Act, showing that this Native American land is being taken from them. It's being devoured by this white person, and it's being taken away. And so that's, what the Dawes Act did.